So you're going to throw me into the lion's den. This is an important question. And as someone who is an outsider of the organization and is in the listening and learn and research phase of this, I'm not going to sidestep your question, but I am going to offer a very qualified response because I don't want to presume to know your organization, to know all of you, to know the history of Alexander and so forth. But I have read the brief passages, and of course, anyone who reads them can find that they're really disturbing, very egregious statements. Now, clearly, this is something that happened in his writings over 100 years ago. And as I've become educated, he seems to have modified his position subsequently. Again, I can't speak to that directly since I have not read any of his works. But I can say what I think is really important in this is that it's important that the organization confront those writings, even though they occurred 100 years ago, and to take a careful look at what that means in terms of the origins of the group and whether or not there is a kind of legacy that's left behind. As is not at all to suggest that any member of this organization is somehow in consensus with those points of view. I am certain there are not. At the same time, that kind of language frames the basis of what he did and has framed the basis of the philosophy, procedures, and practices of, at least in part, of what this organization has done. So taking a hard look at the past and looking at what is sometimes referred to as a history of the present, which is simply to say, what traces, if any, show up in this organization now? When we talk about social justice, when we talk about issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, four major things need to be looked at. And this relates in part to the perception of the organization historically and currently. Those four things include access to the organization, access and accessibility. If you use the metaphor of a house, who is invited to the front door of the house and who is allowed in? That's about access. The second area that you always want to look at is representation. And these are the questions then that are rising about what the demographic profile of AmSAT looks like. Who is represented and who is in the house, so to speak, who has been invited in, and now who is actually in the house, and what do they look like? What do they sound like? What are their backgrounds? What are their abilities and inabilities? What is their socioeconomic backgrounds? All of those issues that you've raised before. So the second thing is representation. The third thing you want to look at is participation. Who is actually engaged directly in the business and life of the organization? AmSAT, as I understand it, is a group that is very strongly community-based, and yet the work that you do seems to be very, very independent, one from another. And so, who's participating in the community building here? How many of your people are participating, and who's at the table, so to speak? What does that representation look like, not only in terms of race and ethnicity, but in terms of gender, socioeconomic background, LGBTQ, questions of people with disabilities, and so forth? Who's participating in the process of helping the organization advance in terms of policies, procedures, innovations, new practices that might be adapted, and who among your both teachers and students are participating in this process. And the final thing is perhaps the most important: who are making the decisions? Who, and this is about decision making as the fourth kind of thing. Who's, and this is no slight on the board or anybody else in leadership right now, but what does your board look like? Who are your leaders right now? What do they look like? And who is represented there? Who has authority? And how does that authority play out? And whenever we're talking, I think, about questions of history, we have to look at the relationship between the past and how it has shown up in the present. If this is a predominantly white and female organization, there are reasons for that in terms of historical development and current circumstances. And all of those things have to be kind of measured. We have to look at this as a very complex set of issues. I'm not at all suggesting that that means that this organization is a font of systemic racism and institutionalized oppression and so forth. But there's something to look at here, that has to, I think, look at access, representation, participation, and power, authority, who's making decisions. Because I think it will reflect, what it is that your past is, what it is your present is, and what your future aspirations are and what they will be. Um, it's a time, because of this kind of urgency about issues in the wake of George Floyd, Arbery, Breonna, and others, to really look directly and as honestly as possible. People talk about a safe space, for people of color and members of other marginalized groups and organizations. The other piece of this that many of you may have already heard is you not only want a safe space, you want a brave space. These are two things that complement each other. The safe space carves out opportunities for people in marginalized groups to literally feel that they have a place, that they can speak, without being concerned about their marginalized backgrounds or the communities come from. That's the safe space which is why affinity groups exist in different organizations. Affinity groups may be about race, around LGBTQ issues, around disability, and so forth. But there are groups that provide that kind of safe space. But in addition to that, every organization needs to have a brave space. And that's a space where you can confront for yourselves, in yourselves, the difficult questions. And one of those difficult questions for this organization is Alexander, who he was, what he means for this organization, what his name means for this organization. This is a question, as you know, is rising all over the country around naming of organizations and so forth. I'm not suggesting that you take away his name. I'm not suggesting that you go by the A technique in the future. I am suggesting that you have that conversation because I think it matters. And it matters as much now as it did 100 years ago. So that's a very long-winded response to your question.